I'm going to start out. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and this has a lot to do with the traditional owners of the lands where the French colonized. So there will be several references to that in the talk, and a translation problem that you can think about, remembering Colonial Algeria's Grand Sud, which I translated as the Great South, but Google recommends Deep South. Yeah, see, Jenny coming from the Deep South. It's a bit of a problem, isn't it? So I thought I'd play with that a little bit, but we'll see. It's not really relevant too much to the paper, but you can think about that throughout. So now to start out with a critique of UQ. In 2018, the University of Queensland started a campaign with the slogan "Own the Unknown." Some of you have heard me talk about it before. And that's my acknowledgement. Which to me has always resonated colonial mission. And while I used the slogan, the use of the slogan waxed and waned, it came back last year on bus stops. You might have seen it here in Brisbane as Master the Unknown, which is infinitely better, as we know. So this paper is about memories of the desert, and the desert, specifically the Sahara, during the French conquest and empire, was one of the greatest unknowns in Africa. The word desert itself conjures up blank space and the empty spaces of the colonial landscape, which has been fictionalized as not having borne evidence of civilization prior to the conquest. Owning the unknown might seem innocuous to a university based on discovery. This is not far removed from the declaration of Australia and other colonized lands as terra nullius, or nobody's land, because there were few observable people where the colonizers landed. Unoccupied land has long been declared open to the takers. In The Formation of Natural Law to Justify Colonialism, Richard Waswell cites Virgil just prior to the Common Era, and I quote, "The seizure of vacant space is regarded as a law of nature. Even if claimed by some sovereign, if it's empty, it can be lawfully occupied, since the law of nature abhors a vacuum, and the earth was made to be peopled." Even when land was peopled, colonizers were still able to make claims to it. Benjamin Ferguson and Roberto Veneziati point out in Territorial Rights and Colonial Wrongs, and I quote, "First, early modern authors claimed that indigenous people lacked rights over land and natural resources because they failed to satisfy criteria of just acquisition." And the 17th century Dutch diplomat, I'll probably say his name wrong, Grotius, doesn't sound Dutch, famously argued, quote, "If within the territory of a people there is any deserted and unproductive soil, this also ought to be granted to foreigners if they ask for it. Or it is right for foreigners even to take possession of such ground for the reason that uncultivated land ought not to be considered as occupied." That's the end of the quote. And of course, this was further supported by Locke in 1689. Algeria has often been portrayed as a blank canvas and a disorganized territory run by the Ottoman Turks until the French haphazardly invaded in 1830. After the infamous fly swatter affair, France brought its military, made its way into Algiers, and eventually wandered into the whole country. They were ill prepared for the conquest. But the continual references to the deserted landscape, such as swamps and wastelands, contributed to the portrayal of an empty country built by the French Empire, which brought modern roads and architecture from the 19th to the middle of the 20th centuries. The desert, though resistant to colonization, is one of the most apparently vacant spaces, often considered devoid of life. The Sahara is often imagined as a broad expanse of dry earth or sand dunes, some palm trees and camels, and a few Bedouins living peacefully near an occasional oasis. In her work on depictions of the desert, showcasing emptiness, Amina Zarzi explains, and I quote, "The arduous colonial experience of crossing the desert elicited profuse geographical, scientific, and mystic interrogations, often projected in a literary inquiry of the French engagement with the theme of emptiness." This narrative of emptiness supported the colonial mission. According to the Center, let's see, I've translated this, the Center for the Historical Documentation of Algeria, in the article, The Conquest of the Sahara, Governor General Jonard in 1905 described the desert as an unprofitable country where there are no means of communication, no surface water, no hydraulic tools, where the telegraph network is incomplete, and in which public education and support services are still in a rudimentary state, in regions, simply put, where everything still remains to be built. The governor proposed that as France would be unable to make a profit, any resources should be reinvested for those who do the work. This again implies that the desert was a blank canvas open to the settlers who were willing to sacrifice. Despite depictions of the Sahara as devoid of life and meaning, Bernie Seb has studied the Saharan literary heroes of the 20th century using the term Saharomania. And this is used to describe the appeal of mysterious territories. And he wrote about this in this book, Heroic Imperialists in Africa. Seb offers a contrasting view of the colonial lands as attractive because of the vastness of the unknown. And this was firmly implanted in popular travel writing of the 18th and 19th centuries. I quote Seb, "The interaction between the white man and the African environment and the Africans captured the reader's imagination, making imperial heroes the ideal topic for successful books, testified by the rise to prominence of the literary genre of travel writing throughout the period." The desert was depicted as a place of creative imagination, difference, vast emptiness, and death. It provided the ideal backdrop for a man versus nature plot conflict with its threatening harshness and lack of water. It begets curiosity because of its strangeness. Here's some of the books. I like books. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but I have a lot of coffee table books. So I've been working. The other day I thought maybe we should write a book about coffee table books. I'm sure it has. I have a very specific corpus and it's doing a lot of strange things. The fascination with the Sahara carried into the memorial books created for the community of Pieds Noirs in the second half of the 20th century. While most French colonials in Algeria lived on the Mediterranean coast in cities such as Algiers and Oran, or in not too distant inland towns like Constantine, those, let me give you a map to help you a little bit. That's a recent map. Those who settled further afield in communities bordering or in the Sahara desert like Aflou, Batna, Biskra, or Kenchela, had vastly different experiences of colonial life. I can't point out all of them, but you can see Biskra, Batna. And you can see even Constantine is very close to the desert. I know people from Superhas, for example, they'll talk about their experience being quite diverse as compared to those who lived in Algiers, which was very settled by the French. These settlers were often isolated outsiders, subdued by the remote terrain. In my previous work on French Algerian memorial books, I've focused on the repeated iconic images of recognizable destinations and events that overlap and solidify in the memory of Algeria's former French inhabitants, the Pieds Noirs. Within these same memorial texts, the desert, which occupies 80% of Africa's largest continent, country, not continent, Africa's largest country, has always been present. Photographs from the 1850s onward, attempting to capture the country for its French occupiers, depict the desert as a peaceful and quiet landscape with exotic indigenous figures, traditional houses, and little evidence of Europeans in the frame. Locations are hard to pinpoint outside of the occasional oasis, and the sand dune landscapes would have been shifting. So again, this runs contrary to those other images that we see where we're solidifying an image. This image is not a little bit less descript and constantly moving as well. Though the desert is one of the most marked features of Algeria, its depiction is heavily offset by the coastal cities and ports with European monuments, citizens and buildings dominating the scene. And this paper will examine how colonial photographs and sparsely written textual souvenirs of the desert provide a contrapuntal image of colonial Algeria. Using Dylan Trigg's work on place and memory, the paper will explore the juxtaposition of the nostalgic vision of European settlement and images of the desert. And I'll focus on three following coffee table books. I think I've got them in that picture. Marie Cardinal's Les Pieds Noirs, which was published in 1988. Elizabeth Fechner's Le Pays d'où je viens, or the country, my home country, I guess one way you could translate it, published in 1999. And L'Algérie oubliée, so that's the last one there on the slide, which was published in 2004. One of the earliest French Algerian memorial books was Les Pieds Noirs by Marie Cardinal. And I just want to say briefly, I discovered this book quite on accident. I was in an art history class as an undergraduate, and I had been reading the literature of Marie Cardinal, and I knew this book existed, and I really wanted to get my hands on it. It was the first time I ever did interlibrary loan. It was like magic when I got this book. I was like, oh, this book came to me from France. It was miraculous. But I studied this book as an undergrad and could not make sense of it. It's got about 1/3 autobiography. It's very, very strange. So I've always loved this large coffee table book for its black and white nostalgic photographs of Algeria. By the way, I own it now. It's in my office. Its odd juxtaposition of autobiography, photography, and history. I'd previously focused on the images of European architecture, infrastructure, and individuals, both Algerian and European, until I went searching for the desert when the call for papers for the conference that I just attended went out. I thought, what can I write about the desert? Yeah, the desert was here. The depictions that I'd often overlooked with sand dunes and an occasional oasis, palm trees, and the Bedouins started to take shape as an essential counterpoint to colonial Algerian souvenirs. Memorial books are primarily destined to reinforce the visual background of the former colony for the ex-settlers, who in this case were exiled in 1962 when Algeria won the war for independence. A second mission of the coffee table books is to share this so-called paper homeland with their descendants who would likely never experience Algeria firsthand. While the books focus on the recognizable, which will trigger memories for the target readers, some also delve into the more mysterious and unruly spaces, which were acknowledged but relatively unknown. Oh, I've got the picture there, right? So starting with Cardinal's 1988 black and white memorial book for the Pied Noir, these coffee table books label the photos of the desert as Le Sud, or the South. And the photographed buildings display Arab-influenced arches and cupolas and an occasional high minaret. The Pied Noir, Les Pieds Noirs, includes photos from French Algerian historians, such as even Benjamin Stora, who would have been quite young at that time, and Janine de la Hogue, and also from Paris Match, which is one of the most famous French magazines. And they included sites such as Bou Saada and its oasis, Biskra with its palace, hotel, and casino, the marketplaces of La Goutte, the city of Gardaïa, with the bustling market and men, camels, donkeys, clothing. This is Gardaïa, by the way, and we'll come back to this picture later as well. The accompanying text explains that at the end of the 2nd century, with the introduction of camels, caravans in the desert could move faster, and Berbers, which we don't call them Berbers anymore, but that's the citation in the book, became rebels resistant to the dominance of Rome. And quote, it allowed adventurous travelers to discover the magic of the desert and the miracle of water in the oases. The authors make a long list of cities and towns that arose in the desert along the way as a trade route. The weekly market is contrasted with the otherwise silent and closed houses with few windows and only one door. Artesian wells dug in the late 19th century and up to 1,000 meters deep provided water and vegetation. In 1939, petrol was discovered in the Sahara. The images in this section of the book are also accompanied by a poetic text by Isabelle Eberhard. And I have a quote. I don't know if I put it up. No, I don't have it on the slide. I'll leave that there for a minute. Lo and behold, the sun has disappeared, and almost immediately, slowly, the blaze of dunes and cupolas begins to darken to marine violet, and those deep shadows which seem to come out of the darkened earth, resurfacing, crawling, extinguish gradually the gleams that still light up the peaks. That was Eberhard reflecting on her experience in the desert. As the photos progress, and there were only 6 pages of these photos in this book, the south, that's dedicated to the south, the desert takes over, and eventually you see more. You can see it here in the pictures. You've got progressing from cities and markets to the camels and the desert. Scrub brush, less civilization. The texts are deeply poetic and picturesque. And this is another quote. The south is where the violent simoon wind moves the blonde dunes, deceives the riders blinded by the sand, forces them to dismount and sit down, curled up in their burnous with their hood carefully folded down. I'm going to pass on to the next book now. In Elizabeth, oh, that's not it. That's still the Simoon. You've got the wind. You've got you can see the people sitting because the wind is blowing the sand. Yeah. In Elizabeth Fechner's 1999 book, Le Pays de Julien, or My Homeland, whose purpose is to tell the story of Algeria to the children and grandchildren of the Pied Noir, the major focus is on European cities along the coast, or just to the interior as well. But again, there are a few pages dedicated to the Great South. Fechner writes in her introduction of her limited settler perspective, and she says, tell of Algeria? Yes, but which one? The one I had known in the 1950s when it was already becoming no longer French. My mother's Algeria in Oran in the 1930s, which had barely finished being Spanish. The Algeria of oases, cob houses built of straw and sand, the Algeria of palm trees, or the Algeria of plane trees, macadam and bistros. The Algeria of pioneers, market gardeners, small traders, or the one of big plantation owners and playboys. And how can we tell of the landscapes, the sites, without evoking lifestyles as different as the alegria of the big cities, the harshness of the countryside, up to the despair, renunciation, and already exile, the nonchalance of the Great South, sickening like a Turkish delight, timeless like the desert. That was fun to translate. And then she continues just a little bit. Finally, we can speak of others, of those we called Arabs and who were not only Muslims, but Berbers, Mozabites, Huluglis, Waled Nayel, as different from each other as we ourselves were from each other. So she's trying to make some kind of acknowledgement that Algeria was indeed diverse, but she's solidifying it there in her book with a few images. Much of Fechner's introduction laments the difficulty of finding images that documented their shared Algerian past, as diverse as it was, because many of the Pieds Noirs had fled quickly in 1962 under the slogan, the suitcase or the coffin. Several publishing companies, Friends, and the Archives d'Outre-mer allowed her to reconstruct the cities in which the Pieds Noirs came of age. Fechner's work on the Le Grand Sud is in line with her other collective memorial books. She has about maybe 5 or 6 of these books, I think, and they're often dedicated to one particular town. This one, because it's about all of Algeria, is a little bit different, so she can have the desert in there. It wouldn't be marketable to sell just a book on the desert, probably. But she recreates each city with photographs of its memorial touchstones. The dedicated desert section centers on towns such as Tamanrasset, which occupies the last 2 pages of the book, with a large mud fortress and a quote from de Gaulle, who stated famously in a speech, France from Dunkirk to Tamanrasset. So most of us have never heard of this place, but there it is in the book with the quote from de Gaulle. According to Fechner, Tamanrasset's population was almost entirely Tuareg. Like Cardinal's work of more than a decade prior, the accompanying texts are contributed by other members of the Pieds Noirs community. For example, Monique Laval contributes a memory from Hassi Messaoud, where she performed a play in 1959. The town was 1,000 kilometers from Algiers and surrounded by desert. Laval explains that there was a church, a school, 2 airfields, and a playhouse. Hassi Messaoud had 1,500 inhabitants, mostly technicians, geologists, military personnel with their families, and a handful of civilians. And I quote Laval, besides a sports ground with a pool and lights that kept them safe at night and day, with permanent light and sound, they had no leisure activities, no opportunity to have fun. That's why we came here at the end of a tour that had lasted several weeks. Now, the notion of wandering the desert used in my title harkens back, of course, to the Old Testament account of Judaic exile, but also the French wandering into an unknown Algeria unprepared. In this previous example, however, Laval underscores the intentionality of visiting the desert. The theater troupe arrived by airplane on a small airstrip, while the sets arrived in trucks. Everything, including the food people ate, was imported to sustain the population. According to photographer Alain Seb, people in the Sahara are either born there or they choose to come. Unlike other travel locations that could be incidental, the Sahara is a place for which visitors must be prepared. In Amina Zarzi's Showcasing Emptiness, she examines how the Sahara's emptiness lent itself to spiritual quests. She writes, and I quote, "The arduous colonial experience of crossing the desert elicited profuse geographical, scientific, and mystic interrogations, often projected in a literary inquiry of the French engagement with the theme of emptiness." Zarzi states that in some cases, quote, "the call of the desert was merely part of a literary trajectory, inspired by historical circumstances and fueled by the growing public interest in these spaces that were physically empty, but in the eyes of many, spiritually full," end quote. So the unique interest in the desert and its people is indeed part of what Bernie Seb called Saharomania. And that is, quote, a complex projection playing at various cultural and political levels carved in the French colonial imaginary. So the emptiness is both enticing for its survival challenge, but also as a space of projected ideals. So in the third and final book that I'm going to talk about today, The Forgotten Algeria, is like the two preceding books in that the desert occupies the end of the story. So all three of them just plop the desert at the end of the book. The Guichetot and Combier dedicate the last 40 pages of the book to the call of the desert. The large-scale black and white and sometimes moderately colorized images of the desert in this section are absolutely striking. The barrenness of the desert is a mere backdrop for the central figures in turbans with camels in the puddles of an oasis, gathering in markets, climbing palm trees, and servicing wells. And I didn't even notice this until the day of my presentation. This is the same picture that was also in Les Pieds Noirs, and it appears again in The Forgotten Algeria. So there's a little bit of repetition still happening across these colonial images, maybe limited photographs, I'm not really sure. Guichetot and Combier also include atypical images, a view of Tlemcen, which is filled with vegetation. Put that in there. Yep. The snowy hills of Crea, where there's a ski station, where the snow remains sometimes as long as April, it says in the book. And the image of an imam calling prayer from a mosque in a sacred city in the deep south. That's the quote on the page. And this focalizes the mystical aspect of the desert in this picture. Though textual memories are sparse in the book, the visual depictions of the desert about the forgotten Algeria focus squarely on life. The Call of the Desert section, curiously but understandably, ends with a double-page photograph of a large passenger boat called El Jazair before the closing credits of the book. No words indicate the location of the port, clearly divorced from the desert, but the nostalgia of those who have left Algeria, especially during the post-independence exodus of 1962, they're clearly evoked here. So that would have been referenced to the departure. Also, Les Pieds Noirs ends with a picture of a boat and a picture of an airplane with not much text whatsoever. So it's just evoking that that's your homeland and now it's gone. The primary call of the desert in these texts is life in an absent space, vast horizons that make a tourist, nomad, or exile dream. Bernie Seb in Oases of Imperial Nostalgia explains how the desert landscape opened to colonization and how the images and memories of desert places in the empire have largely been ignored. So I'll just read that quickly. Seen as peripheral regions conquered almost absent-mindedly and often neglected in favor of more prosperous colonies, desert spaces have hitherto remained confined to the, I had to look up the pronunciation, punctum secum, which means blind spot, of imperial historiographies. Yet most global empires have seen themselves expand into wild and empty expanses, be they in Africa, the Middle East, Australia, or Central Asia. In many cases, such episodes have been represented as non-events, just good enough to expand the geographical extension of imperial representations on maps. Seb also outlines France's post-colonial engagement with the Sahara, creating a, quote, nostalgia for empire and a magnet for a desert industry. So he would be a little bit more skeptical about the inclusion of these pictures in the books. I think it's part of the magic of North Africa, in his view. In The Aesthetics of Decay, Dylan Trigg reflects on his own observations of Death Valley. And I quote, contact with human life, moreover, disproves our belief that desolate space is deserted too. And Trigg more recently argues that by being in the same space at the same time, we can share emotions. Conversely then, if the space is unpopulated, we might recognize a singularity of experience. In The Memory of Place, Trigg builds an argument that the deserted and solitary landscapes are the ideal loci for memory building. Trigg's work highlights the function of the desert in these memorial books. By placing the most deserted landscapes at the end of each of the books, the desert arises as a counterpoint. It emphasizes the unfamiliar to the former colonial inhabitants. It was a wild space that was acknowledged and unknown. It was claimed or owned by the French, but still mostly unknown at the end of the colonial endeavor in 1962. The Sahara, with its vast expanses of remote terrain, remained mysterious and unbridled. Yet the authors also highlight that the centrality of life that is uncovered when one wanders the desert. The counterpoint of the unfamiliar reminds that there is a sacred aspect that can be preserved by unknowing. Hence, the books close on the desert and the boat, the great unpossessed South, and the Exodus. Thank you. We have 3 people online. What a turnout.
Yeah. Questions and answers. Of course, I might perhaps give Jenny first refusal, and she has to leave early. You don't have to ask anything. But, if you wanted to ask anything, you can go first. Go away you go then. Yeah.
What was the point?
No, I didn't say it. Someone who grew up in the West, very European, right? American. I see the images as very aesthetically pleasing, right? Is it because I'm a Westerner? Am I giving some sort of Orientalist, making them idealized?
This is built into, that's what Seb is getting at. This is built into our knowledge of the desert. We have these romantic, beautiful ideas. I can tell you, when I was in Arizona for this conference, we went horseback riding in the desert. It was not romantic. It was lovely and beautiful. And there was like the desert was in bloom and all that, but I had sun, like sand was just blowing in my face. So it was
The
crazy.
desert is not a nice place.
No, but the pictures come out beautiful, right? Because you've got this like the air is pure kind of thing, and the sky is super blue,
And that image of the
mountains.
Amman calling, that
Yeah.
was amazing.
and that was they made it colorized, obviously.
Yeah, but it just looked like a still out of a
Yeah.
brilliant movie.
So part of the project, and if I were to work on a larger project, which I haven't decided I will yet, but if I did, I would look at the limited number of photographs that are available. So I have this, like, there's at least 7 books that I've identified that have pictures of the desert and they're trying to reproduce Algeria. But there were a limited number of pictures. So like we saw that photo of Gardaia, which is repeated. And I think that happens quite a lot across the book. So everybody that makes one of these books is constantly trying to find photos that we haven't seen yet. And it's not easy when you're looking at colonial texts and photographs. 2 of the books, which I excluded on purpose, were specifically about photography and about photography in the regions, in the colonies, and how it worked. And it's very, it would be great if you're in art history, if you're not properly. So, but really interesting to think about the techniques and the evolution and the different photographers who came and who took which picture at what time, and not so much about the nostalgia, but the people buying these books want that. If you can't make a book and not have the desert in it. But at the same time, I've known these books for a long time, and I was like, is the desert in these books? I don't even remember if the desert was there. I'm sure the desert must be there. And it was. Yeah, and sometimes quite a lot. But yeah, I think it is a romantic cultural production. Yeah.
I'm sort of wondering, Jenny, if people who did picture books about Alabama and the surrounding states would also sort of aestheticize them and romanticize them.
They absolutely would.
So
What you're getting.
Les Pieds Noirs has this beautiful photograph of children working in the fields and in the cotton fields. And they're smiling. Yeah.
They're probably smiling because they got to pause from working for 10 seconds.
Yeah, maybe.
Photograph
Just like, but they're bent over and.
being made. Yeah, I mean, if you like, Amy, you can direct the question and answer. I'm not really.
If Joe wants to, Joe, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, can you hear me from, is that okay?
Yep.
So, Amy, thank you very much. I was wondering, there's writing on British colonialism where, I'm sorry if I might have missed this, I had to duck out for a second, but where I was interested in the metaphors that you were using, such as barren, for example, and there's writing on the British Empire where either the desert is barren or the Arctic or Antarctic are seen as frigid, which are metaphors which go with femininity. And it requires a masculine intervention to correct that in some way, that intervention being colonialism in those cases. Are there hints of that in these books, do you think?
Yes, but I haven't thought that through yet. But I think that is the whole metaphor. That's why it is empty, it is barren, and we need to bring something to it. So I'm not sharing my screen anymore. No, I'm not. Let me just share my screen again. This is a picture from a recent book, more recent anyway, not recent, like maybe 2012 by Jan Arthus Bertrand. And all of his books show this desert landscape of Algeria. He goes to Algeria and does aerial photographs, and there's a film that goes along with it. But interestingly, you might not notice it or pick it out right away, but this is a petrol. Right there. So all of his pictures look like this moving landscape that's devoid of life, but he always has life hidden in these photographs. So what I would want to do if I develop this then is to look at the more modern ways of seeing Algeria and how the life is actually the focus. And I think that L'Algérie oubliée tried to do that a little bit as well. Just by every picture, although you have this beautiful, well, not beautiful backdrop. It's a very desert, barren backdrop, but you have these beautiful people dressed in traditional clothing, but it brings them to the foreground and really highlights that stark contrast of life and the difficulty of desert life. So I think the narrative is shifting, but I think, yes, absolutely, that concept of barrenness was very useful, extremely useful. And I wanted to, when I was in Arizona, I was hoping to look at some of the archives as well. My feeling is that the same has been true in the United States and their narratives of the desert, and that was used to push the First Nations people off of their reservations.
Well, I was going to say,
Yeah,
surely
well.
it's accompanied by the civilizing
Yes,
motif.
yes,
The
well, that's,
two dominant things, the male and the superior,
Yes.
quote unquote, superior.
and so in Les Pieds Noirs, which only does give the 6 pictures here, a lot of it is, there's a section called L'homme et la terre, so man and land, but it talks about how the Europeans brought life, basically.
Yeah.
It is, and that's in the 80s. So I mean, this is before we really started post-colonial studies in full force. You give me,
Just a bit like, you know, on social media, it looks great. And
Yeah.
it looks great when you're there. It's like if you were there as a photographer taking these photos, like that one of the children in cotton fields.
yes,
That would not be good either.
no,
You know, nobody makes photo books about somewhere that says this joint is a dump, you know, don't go there. I'm glad I wasn't there, you know.
and this is the aesthetic mission, right? Like nobody wants to buy. Like I've worked on Nicole Guillermo's art quite a lot. She's a survivor of a bombing. Her artwork is horrific. And I always think like, who's buying that artwork? Nobody's really buying the artwork, right? So you have to have a different way of supporting yourself if you're gonna put out disgusting images of people being tortured and things like that. It's important artwork, and I think that it needs to be valued. But if you want to sell coffee table books, you have to think about what you're gonna put. They're quite expensive. So who's gonna buy these expensive coffee table books? And the great thing is, in French, they're called les beaux livres. In English, they're not called beautiful books, but they are in French, they're beautiful books. There's a sense of, you need to have something aesthetic to look at. Yeah, get the people back. Yes,
So where were all of the old images originally sourced from, like, or what were they for? Were they just sent back to people in metro banks?
so most of these were not just haphazard photographs. They had Agence France Presse, so the journalists would have come in and taken photographs at some point. Sometimes we have military photographs that were taken for specific purposes. Some of the books I've looked at have the contingent soldiers in Algeria. They had their own photographs, but they were very controlled and limited in what they could take pictures of when they were there. But most of these, actually in that one picture that I just had up, I won't put the screen back up again, but you can see it here. This was one of the first photographers in Algeria. So there is that history of people who traveled through the Sahara, this very romantic notion of I'm going to go into the Sahara and capture pictures that have never been taken before. There's a bit of an anthropological ideal behind it. We're going to see these, is it a spider?
Having its legs.
It's a spider. It's little.
It's okay.
It's all right. It's just a little spider.
Not like we're in the desert.
But this text, the text accompanying text talks about him. It says, yeah, it's what his name on there. René Cour, l'aventurier photographe. So he was an
Right,
adventurer,
adventurer.
photographer, adventurer, right? So that was a real job. Not very many people probably had it.
Like, you know, oh, well, I'm here to document this.
That's right.
It didn't exist before I was here. But
So I started thinking about this after I gave my paper, and I have a line in there about universities based on discovery, and I started thinking about there is no discovery, right? Clearly, there were people that lived there before. So this whole notion that we are discovering things is not really genuine. We're actually documenting. We're observing, we're documenting, we're reporting, we're trying to understand, but we're not actually, there's nothing new under the sun that we're actually discovering at this point. I don't think there are things that existed. Well, maybe it's different if you have microscopes and things, I don't know, but but in this sense, it wasn't really, it's not discovery.
The popped into my mind when you're talking about the adventure photographer Robin Davidson in Australia. Studies of they're quite, I don't know, Tim or somebody might recall, it might go back to the 1980s or 1990s or something, but Robin, either Davison or Joe might recall, Robin Davison or Davidson went into the desert and did, I might Google it.
Ah,
Yeah, could I just ask, I did write it down, when you're among yourselves at the French Studies Conference, everybody knows, but what in God's name was the infamous fly swatter affair? Which you fly swatter affair, you said at the beginning.
Fly swatter affair.
After the infamous fly swatter affair,
Yeah,
of course.
I thought that when you said it, you probably don't know. So what happened, there are various accounts, but what happened is that France needed money. They said, oh, Algeria owes us a lot of money. So they went to Algeria. This was in 1827, I believe. And Algeria was administered by the Turkish Empire at the time. So there was a person in control named the Dey d'Alger. That's his title, the Dey d'Alger. And the French military went in and said, you owe us money, you need to pay us. And he took the fly swatter and went, Tiskin apparently swatted the person. This is all pretense, right? But he apparently swatted the person who came from France and said, you know, forget your money. And this started the war. And when France arrived, Joe, you can correct me anytime. When France arrived with their boats and they came ashore, they realized that Algiers was not protected at all. And they kind of accidentally started to colonize the land unprepared. Well, they realized that, oh, we have an opportunity here, right? So they hadn't prepared. This caused a lot of problems, obviously, linguistically and culturally and all sorts of things. They just kind of came in there. And then, of course, they did get prepared when they realized that they could take over so easily. But the conquest, I had a map up there of the conquest. It took a really long time to get into the Sahara. And there were, the Amazigh people were very resistant. The people living in the mountains and the remote areas and the desert areas would have been very, very difficult to fight them on their home territory.
And then to hold what you.
Yes, and how do you keep possession of that? And during the Algerian War, they rounded up people in these areas and they put them into refugee camps, basically. So that was one of the ways to control them.
Yeah, I might just sort of send you a link or something. About 100 years later, there's an equally notorious incident. Tim might be able to give more details when the Germans were running Alsace and Lorraine, known as the Zabern incident, Z-A-B-E-R-N, where the German garrison beat up on some guy for being disrespectful or not saluting or something like that. So it's a sort of similar German thing later on, yeah, but against the French, not so. So.
Well, I think that Algerie Vue does that. That's on the cover of the book. But again, it's quite contemporary. And they sell that book. Also, Benjamin Stora wrote the, you know, I love Benjamin Stora. I can't give a talk with it. So Benjamin Stora wrote the preface to this book as well. And he makes a whole point about this is Algeria that no one has ever seen before, right? So that's the sales pitch right there. It's like, even I, who grew up in Algeria, I've never seen anything like this before. So these are new images, but there's a lot of the desert, lots and lots of pages of the desert in that book. That's quite beautiful. But again, always some focalized form of life in that image somewhere.
It struck me as you were talking that it seems to be a sort of enduring genre, given that the first one you talked about was published in 59 and the last one you talked about was published in 2004.
Oh, 88. 88 was the first one. What did I have in 59? I might have mentioned something from 59.
Oh, well, okay, yeah, but okay, so
from the 80s onward.
Yeah, so I must have, might have just been when the woman left Algeria or something like that. do you think it's going to sort of semi-disappear into history as the sort of living memory of?
I keep thinking it will, but
Yeah, but it's sort of keeps popping up.
well, look, like the Pied Noir are dying now, so. And France is finally trying to reconcile its memories, which is the other thing I keep talking about with, because Benjamin Stora is the person there to reconcile the memories. But it's not, there's a new person on the commission. So France did name a Truth and Memory commission of historians, and they have Algerian historians they're working with to finally lay this story to rest together. And one of the French historians, his name is Tramor Kemener. He keeps publishing photographical books.
Well, possibly they'll run out of photographs, but maybe not very
That's-
soon.
I
And then
think
they'll just
that's
start
it.
recycling, you know.
So for one of the books that
Yeah,
came
they'll
out,
dip into people's family albums.
that's what they're doing.
Yeah, right.
That's really what they're doing. And so with the war conscripts, that's what they did. They dug in and they were like, they said they received 2,000 photos from individuals who just sent their home photographs. And then they dug through them to make their book. Thank you, Jenny.
Excellent as always.
Oh, thank you. You're sweet.
We might just check perhaps as Tim is the person online who hasn't asked a question, he might want to. but
Don't
we
put
might
him on the
check.
spot.
He doesn't have to if he doesn't want to.
Tim-
He's unmuting, so.
I'm unmuting just simply to say that thanks for your talk, Amy. I don't have a particular question, but I am enjoying the way you're describing from yet another perspective, the Pied Noir.
Well, Tim, could I perhaps, and again, you don't have to say anything, what struck, and I'm not quite sure about your knowledge of this. What struck me when Amy was talking was the little I know of German novels, which wrote about colonialism, including in Africa, although further south. And of course, they're coming the German novels are coming quite late in the piece historically because of how, you know, the Germans that are being out of the colonial race until they unified and so on. And the handful that I know, mostly through Gabriel Reuter, are in fact very much about the land not being barren, but being occupied. And it's about, you know, it's not something I've made a study of, but I've read a few of them and seen references to other ones. Also, there were one said that the woman Reuter, she actually was a child. She was a child in Egypt. She had brothers in Argentina and so on. It's actually very much about either showing the indigenous population how it's done by setting up businesses and mines and stuff, or as a preliminary to that, killing them so you can set up business. And I don't know if Tim has any knowledge to add to this, but it did strike me as a different sort of thing from what Amy was talking about.
I can respond a little bit because there were other French colonies in Africa
Yeah.
that were treated much differently.
Right, okay, yeah. So, you
So
get that,
even thinking about Cameroon, for example,
Right.
Cameroon had the Germans, the English, and the French there. They were, what do they call them? They weren't settler colonies, right? So it was they were administrative colonies. So they were very much about organizing and showing you what the Europeans can bring.
yeah,
in.
and extracting the
Here's
natural
healthcare.
resources if there were any and all that.
Here's your educational system, here's your political systems. We talked about that in our course about Senegal. So a lot of that remains where it's changed in France, still lingers in some of the former colonies. We have those systems that remain. But Algeria, because it was a settler colony, they had to make this discourse about the land being barren so they could justify actually moving in and taking over. So I think it's a little bit different there. If they had focused on how many people were there and the lives that they were living, it would have been much, it would have been much.
Well, with one of
more
these
difficult.
novels by Reuter, it's more the Germans have got to come in and organise the joint project to extract.
Germans.
Yeah, to extract the minerals and to organise the trade in the cattle and all this sort of stuff, you know, and sort of knock over Catholicism, of course, because they weren't interested in that, you know, this kind of stuff. So it's a sort of limited knowledge I've got, but it's sort of accurate at its time. So the focus seems to be on sort of, you know, sort of conquest and then exploitation.
I think our next project needs to be colonial memories of Africa.
Well, these things are actually written, it's odd, she's actually writing more or less, yeah, it's a little bit in retrospect, drawing on her childhood and stuff, but she's also sort of publishing at the time or a little bit after the time in the Weimar Republic. So, Stefan Utter has done some work on the German colonists exploiting and exterminating the Herero in what I think is now Namibia. I'm not quite sure. Stefan has had an interest in that. So there's a sort of kernel.
That's interesting, that in Indonesia, obviously, there's a desert. So the colonial novels that I've read, they're all about the European settlements in the indigenous people appear as like, you know, characters in the background. But when they do talk about the landscape, about how beautiful and dangerous the jungle is.
Mm.
The jungle is, yeah.
So it's still, but it's still beautiful and dangerous.
Yeah, but you don't really go there.
Mm.
It's kind of a, yeah. The opposite books in mine been reading the Tanger by, and this is like you never leave that really central and populated area of Tanger,
Mm.
which is it's given that nostalgia of the French Revolution. I think if I remember correctly, the
He was French, but he came from a lower class, so a lot of the poor people wouldn't have left. They wouldn't have been able to really leave their area where they lived. So it makes sense that that would be very enclosed, but also very beautiful. A lot of the things that are focused on that are the sun and the sea and the sights and the, you know, like there is nostalgia definitely present.
Well, I mean, there's that classic thing in the English colonial discourse about, you know, the people who are sort of away for so long from home and don't get the opportunity. Like in the Indian civil service, they had like 7-year tours of duty and stuff. That concept in the English imperial discourse of going native, you know, you
Yes.
get, and it doesn't necessarily mean you adopt the customs, and so you probably in the Indonesian as well. Doesn't necessarily mean that you adopt the customs, but it means that you know, become, you know, you have a sort of genuine bond with the landscape and the food, and sometimes it does mean you
I
adopt the
pointed at
customs of
Doreen
the garb.
because he co-published an article on sustaining Algerian memory through food, and the title of the book had "Going Native" in it, and it was really about colonial.
I mean,
Yeah,
in the
I think
original
that's right.
British colonial discourse, it could mean as far as going and living like a native
Yeah,
kind of thing, or, you know, adopting the native lifestyle to whatever degree. You
so a
know,
lot
was
of the
a thing.
discourse.
And it was frowned upon.
Oh, well, in this literature, there's a lot of discourse about how, oh, the Algerians were our brothers, the Algerians were our friends, you know, like we all got along, and especially Marie Cardinal, her servants were her, she calls her servants her father, you know, like.
Well, you know, Jen, you could maybe do it a little bit better than you, but that's the deep myth of the deep south,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
Of the happy,
we definitely
what
do
were
better
then called
for you.
Negroes. I mean, yeah, the happy Negroes, quote unquote, you
Yeah.
know, yeah. In
So, you know,
addition to the house servants and all that,
We
you
can
know.
debate whether deep south is appropriate or not. Probably not.
Well, I mean, living, you know, being based in Australia, maybe great southern land. Who knows?
Find something.
Okay. Yep.
We good?
So I know Joe's got a final.
Yes, Joe.
Just one last vocab question. If we're not, so in English and in French, so Berber is out.
Yes.
What are we saying in English and in French?
Amazigh.
Amazigh,
Yeah,
as
Amazigh.
for all groups.
Yeah, so it's
Indigenous groups, inverted commas.
Amazigh. And Amazighan is the language, but you can also say Tamazigh with a T at the beginning.
Which I've heard, yeah.
What about
Yes.
English?
So I don't know at what point Berber went out, but I remember teaching maybe here. It was here definitely, but maybe even 5-6 years ago. And a student got very angry with me when I talked about Berber languages. It was in LTCS 2024.
They only discussed this in Algerian law course in 2008.
Yeah.
The term being.
Did they have an
Yeah.
English term that was preferable? They
No,
just
it's
didn't like the
an
Berber term.
indigenous word. So Amazigh is the word. So Berber comes from barbar. So
Okay.
barbar is peoples. Yeah.
Yeah, barbarian.
And then barbarians, yeah, barbarian, exactly. So it has all the negative. There's the Langue de Barbarie in Senegal as well, which is the Barbary coast. Yeah. So it's a European term that's been cast onto these people, which doesn't reflect them. But we did talk about that in the context of Algeria. Part of the problem was that with the Arabization of the country, they cut out French completely, but they also cut out the indigenous languages.
Doesn't
they're
it go-
only going
doesn't
back
it go
to-
back to the Romans, saying that the languages of the conquered peoples are all
Probably.
blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
I think it
probably.
does, is that right?
That's probably correct.
I think it does.
Now you have me thinking about Barbara the elephant.
Ah, yes. We'd better